On tonight's episode, a boy who left home for 5 minutes, then found himself hours away, a rifle that wouldn't fire, silent craft on railway tracks, a family pulled off a mountain road, and a man who vanished for days aboard a strange vessel. Close encounters, spatial dislocation, unseen presences. Welcome to Strange Encounters. In the summer of 1921, long before flying saucers filled headlines and decades before the modern UFO era had a name, an 8-year-old boy wandered into the hills above Marseille, France. By the end of that afternoon, he would claim that 2 tall beings in metallic helmets had taken him aboard a strange machine. No one believed him, and for nearly 30 years, he kept the story to himself. The year was brutally hot, the kind of heat that makes the air shimmer and drains sound from the landscape. The hills near Marseille's North Canal were scarred by excavation, rough and pale, still bearing the industrial wounds of a country recovering from the First World War. The boy, known only by his initials, GB, liked exploring there alone. He later described the terrain as moon-like, bleached, empty, quiet. He had left the nearby road only minutes earlier when something happened. According to a letter he would send decades later to the French magazine Paris Match, 2 beings suddenly emerged from between acacia trees. They were tall, extremely slender. He remembered their height clearly, their thinness. What he could not clearly remember were faces. They wore smooth, pliable helmets that appeared metallic, seamless coverings that concealed any distinct features. No visible mouths, no clearly defined eyes, just a reflective surface where a face should have been. There was no greeting, no warning, no sound. They seized him and pulled him toward an object he described as resembling a tank, oddly shaped, solid, mechanical in appearance, but unfamiliar in design. He did not describe struggling. More disturbingly, he later wrote that he was unable to want to resist. Inside, he found himself seated on what he called a soft couch. His memory of the interior was vague. He recalled rectangular windows, square or nearly square portholes, unlike the circular windows that would later become common in flying saucer imagery. He began to cry. Then something shifted. An opening appeared in the ceiling of the cabin. No hinges, no visible mechanism, simply an aperture forming above him. Within seconds, he was back on the ground. The beings were gone. The machine was gone. The hills were silent again, but he was not where he had been taken. The craft and the beings were gone. He had been returned to a location far from where they picked him up. The boy tried to find his way back to the road he had left only 5 minutes earlier. He believed it was nearby, but it was not. It took him hours of walking through the heat and the scarred hills before he finally reached it. When he returned home and told his parents what happened, they dismissed it as imagination, an adventure story, a child exaggerating after wandering too far in the heat. The experience was not reported publicly. It remained private. Nearly 3 decades passed. Then, in 1950, as France was beginning to experience renewed interest in unexplained aerial phenomena, GB, now an adult, wrote to Paris Match and recounted the event from his childhood. He admitted that memory fades, especially childhood memory. He could not add many new details beyond what had stayed with him all those years, but he stood by the core experience. 2 tall, slender beings, metallic helmets, an oddly shaped craft with rectangular windows, a soft interior seat, a forced entry without resistance, and a long, confusing walk back to the road he thought was only minutes away. What makes this case intriguing is not dramatic spectacle, it's timing. If his account is accurate, the event occurred in 1921. That is decades before Kenneth Arnold's 1947 sighting over Mount Rainier, decades before the 1954 French wave of landing reports, before the phrase flying saucer entered public vocabulary, before science fiction imagery became standardized in the cultural imagination. In 1921, there was no established template for alien abduction narratives, yet certain elements feel familiar to modern ears. Tall figures, feature-concealing helmets, silent efficiency, a sense of mental suppression, the inability to resist, a brief interior experience, then release. Skeptics raise valid concerns. Childhood memory is fragile. Recollection, decades later, is vulnerable to reshaping. By 1950, popular culture had already begun absorbing early science fiction themes. It is possible that over time, fragments of imagination and experience blended. The terrain itself, hot, disorientating, scarred, and empty, could have contributed to confusion. Heat exhaustion in a child can distort perception and memory. Wandering too far from a familiar landmark can create the terrifying sensation of displacement. These explanations remain plausible, but there is one phrase in his letter that resists easy dismissal. He wrote that he was unable to want to resist, not simply unable to move, not frozen in fear, but unable to form the desire to struggle. That phrasing seems unusually precise, and it echoes descriptions that would not become common in close encounter literature for many decades. There is no physical evidence, no corroborating witnesses, no preserved site, only a letter sent to a magazine, a memory carried quietly for 30 years, and a boy who wandered into a war-scarred landscape and came home late, confused and disbelieved. The hills above Marseille are different today. The excavations have softened, vegetation has returned, the scars of industry and war have faded into the landscape. It is difficult, standing there now, to imagine something extraordinary interrupting a child's afternoon. But in the oppressive heat of 1921, in a terrain he described as moonlike and empty, an 8-year-old boy believed he encountered something not meant for him. Something tall, silent, metallic. Something that left him back where he started, yet somehow not where he expected to be. Whether it was misperception, imagination hardened into memory, or an encounter that preceded the modern UFO era by decades, the story remains. Not loud, not dramatic, just a quiet claim. Two beings, a strange machine, and a long walk back to a familiar road that suddenly felt very far away. He almost fired. Standing outside his country house at night, rifle raised to his shoulder, he intended to pull the trigger. And then he couldn't move. Not because he changed his mind, not because he hesitated, because he was unable to. This incident reportedly took place in 1972, somewhere in the southwestern section of France. The exact date was not recorded. The precise location was not publicly disclosed. The witness's identity was withheld. He is referred to only as Mr. X. He was staying at his country house when the event occurred. Night had fallen after a day of rain. At some point, he heard outside what he described as a kind of splashing sound. He stepped onto his front steps and looked into the darkness. At first, he saw nothing that explained the noise. Uneasy, he moved further out. A few dozen meters away, in an adjacent field, he saw a luminous red sphere. He estimated its diameter at approximately 3 to 4 meters. The object emitted a steady red glow. As he observed it, he suddenly felt what he later described as a presence nearby. He turned. In the semi-darkness, he saw 3 or 4 strange beings. They were small in stature. They wore very dark one-piece jumpsuits. They had bald heads and full beards. He described their appearance as horrible. For several seconds, the beings stood motionless, staring at him. During this brief confrontation, he felt transfixed by their gaze. Terrified, he turned and rushed back into his house. Inside, he seized his rifle and loaded it. He returned to the same spot outside. The red sphere was still present. The small beings were now moving quickly toward it at the other end of the field. He raised the rifle to his shoulder with the intention of firing at them. At that moment, he found that he was unable to move. He could not pull the trigger. The beings entered the object. The red sphere then took off silently and at great speed. After it had vanished, he recovered his ability to move. He went back indoors, greatly agitated. In the days that followed, he was unable to sleep for several nights. He subsequently experienced various psychophysiological problems. He absolutely refused to discuss the incident with any UFO investigator. The source of the case learned of the event through a mutual friend. The account was later communicated confidentially to French researcher Alain Gamard on September 15, 1978, by investigator Eric Zurcher. The report remains secondhand. There are no known physical traces, no photographs, no independent witnesses. That is the entirety of the reported incident. Cases like this are difficult. They are brief, secondhand, undated, and yet they contain elements that appear repeatedly in European humanoid encounters. The first is the rural setting. Southwestern France has a long history of close encounter reports, particularly involving landed objects and small beings. During the 1954 French wave, numerous witnesses described small humanoid figures associated with landed craft in isolated fields and rural roads. This 1972 report occurs nearly 2 decades later, but the pattern is familiar. The second element is the craft itself. A luminous red sphere, 3 to 4 meters in diameter, sitting low in a field. Spherical craft are less common than discs in earlier European reports, but by the late 1960s and early 1970s, glowing orbs and spheres became increasingly documented in close-range sightings across Europe. The silence is also notable. No engine noise, no mechanical sound, or rapid departure. That combination, silent lift and high-speed acceleration, appears frequently in close encounter reports. But the most striking feature here is the paralysis. The witness was not passive. He ran inside, he armed himself, he returned with a clear intention to fire. Only when he aimed did he become immobilized. Temporary paralysis during close encounters is a recurring motif in humanoid cases. Witnesses often describe being unable to move, speak, or act while observing entities at close range. In many accounts, mobility returns immediately after the craft departs, exactly as described here. There's no claim of beams of light, no mention of visible devices, no described gesture from the beings, just an inability to move. And then there are the beings themselves, small in stature, very dark one-piece suits, bald heads, full beards. That detail stands out. Modern popular imagery tends to focus on large-eyed, hairless figures, but European cases, particularly older French reports, sometimes describes small, human-like figures, occasionally with facial hair. If fabricated, this description is oddly specific. If genuine, it suggests something far more physical and grounded than later abduction-era imagery. The witness's reaction afterward is also consistent with traumatic close encounter reports. Insomnia, agitation, psychophysiological distress, and perhaps the most telling, refusal. He would not cooperate with investigators. He did not seek publicity. The account surfaced only through a mutual acquaintance years later. From an evidentiary standpoint, this weakens the case. From a psychological standpoint, it complicates it. People who invent stories often want attention. This witness wanted silence. In the end, we are left with a sparse but unsettling report. A man alone at night after rainfall, a splashing sound in the dark, a red sphere in a field, small figures watching him, a rifle that would not fire, and a silent object vanishing into the sky. Was it misperception and darkness? A stress reaction? An altered state triggered by fear? Or did something land in a rural French field in 1972? Something capable of rendering an armed man completely powerless without ever touching him. The file remains thin, but the moment itself, if it occurred as described, would have lasted only seconds. Seconds that the witness reportedly spent unable to move, unable to act, and unable afterward to forget. On September 10, 1954, in a quiet railway crossing in northern France, a man stepped outside because his dog wouldn't stop barking. That's how it began. No streak across the sky, no explosion of light, no warning. Just a railway worker stepping into the dark to quiet an animal that refused to settle. Marius de Wilde lived beside the tracks near the small town of Quarouble, close to the Belgian border. He had worked the railway for years. He knew the sound of cooling steel. He knew the way signal posts cast shadows at night. He knew what belonged on those rails and what didn't. That evening had been unremarkable. Late summer air, fading light, the stillness that settles over farmland after sunset. Then the dog started barking. Not casually, not at some distant noise, but sharply, repeatedly, urgently. De Wilde stepped outside to see what had disturbed it. At first, he noticed nothing unusual. The crossing gate stood still. The rails stretched into darkness. The fields beyond were quiet. And then he saw it. Something was sitting directly on the tracks. It was small, metallic, oval in shape, not large enough to be mistaken for a train car, and far too smooth to resemble farm equipment. Its surface appeared dark, almost matte, but it reflected just enough of the dim evening light to outline its form. It was not moving, it was simply there, and near it were two figures. They were small, roughly 1 meter tall, compact, broad in the shoulders. Their heads appeared large in proportion to their bodies. They seemed to be wearing dark, tight-fitting suits. On their heads were rounded coverings like helmets or dome visors that caught what little light remained. They were not running, not gesturing wildly. They were simply standing beside the object. De Wilde later said he took a few cautious steps forward, trying to understand what he was seeing. He had no framework for it, no context. And then something happened that he struggled to explain. He felt unable to move. Not as if he had tripped or frozen in fear, but as if his body had stopped responding. His legs felt heavy. His arms would not lift. He remained upright, conscious, watching, yet unable to act. The two beings appeared aware of him. They turned calmly and moved back toward the craft. There was no sound of engines, no roar, no rush of air. A soft glow became visible beneath the object, and then it rose, straight upward, silent. Within moments, it was gone. The night returned to what it had been before, still, rural, unremarkable, except it wasn't. His dog, moments earlier aggressive and loud, had retreated. It would not approach the tracks. DeWilde stood there, alone beside the rails, trying to reconcile what he had just witnessed. By morning, the story began to take shape. In daylight, DeWilde claimed that the wooden railway ties where the object had rested showed unusual marks. Some accounts described charring, others mentioned compression in the gravel bed beneath the tracks. The details varied depending on the source, and later retellings are not always consistent. Railway officials reportedly examined the site. Local authorities were informed. Word spread quickly beyond Quarouble. Newspapers began printing accounts of the sighting. For some, it was a curiosity. For others, it was absurd. But DeWilde did not withdraw his claim. He maintained that what he saw was a landed craft and occupants. The case would have likely faded into regional folklore if not for what happened next, because Quarouble was not the only report. In the weeks following September 10th, similar accounts began appearing across France. Farmers described objects resting in open fields. Vineyard workers spoke of small figures moving near metallic shapes at dusk. Motorists claimed to see craft lit vertically from roadside clearings. Between September and November of 1954, France experienced one of the most concentrated UFO waves in modern history. And unusually, many of those reports were not of distant lights in the sky. They were of landings. Witnesses described craft on the ground. Some described tall, slender figures in tight suits. Others described small, helmeted beings, compact, silent, efficient in their movements. Descriptions varied, details conflicted, but certain patterns repeated. The reports were geographically widespread, especially in rural regions. Newspapers amplified the stories, sometimes skeptically, sometimes sensationally. Public interest grew, so did the number of sightings. French researcher Ami Michel would later attempt to map these landing sites, noting alignments he believed were meaningful. Skeptics argued that patterns emerge naturally when enough points are plotted. Believers saw structure. The 1954 wave became a defining moment in European UFO history, and Quarouble stood near the beginning of it. What makes the DeWilde encounter enduring is not just its timing, but its proximity. This was not a distant light, not an ambiguous glow behind clouds. It was an object on railway tracks, beings at close range, a physical location that could be examined the next morning. Of course, alternative explanations exist. Could shadows and machinery have been misinterpreted in low light? Could paralysis have been a stress response? Could media coverage have influenced later recollections? These questions remain, but so does the account. For a brief moment in 1954, in a small railway crossing in northern France, a man claimed that something landed where nothing should have been. The object departed, the tracks remained. And Quarouble became part of a larger mystery that, for a few intense months, seemed to ripple across the French countryside. Whatever happened that night, it began simply with a dog barking at the dark. It was a warm summer evening in August of 1982 when Denise and Ed Stoner set out from their home in Arvada, Colorado, with plans for a weekend camping trip near Buena Vista. The sky was a clear, deep blue, the sun just beginning to deep behind the jagged peaks of the Rockies. The couple, along with their daughter and family dog, were looking forward to a quiet retreat in the mountains, a break from the routine of daily life. As they drove along Kenosha Pass, Denise noticed something unusual in the sky. At first, it was easy to dismiss, a pair of yellow-white lights hovering far off in the distance. But the lights grew steadily, unnervingly, moving closer in a way that didn't follow any normal flight pattern. Ed glanced at them, puzzled, noting how the objects seemed to float without sound, almost deliberately observing their car. Then, without warning, the vehicle began to slide sideways, as if something unseen had gripped it. The car jerked across the asphalt and onto the rough shoulder, and the dog whimpered as the motion threw them all off balance. Denise and Ed recall a strange sensation, a feeling of detachment from time itself. One moment they were on the road, the next it was nearly 11 p.m., dark and silent, and they were miles further along than they should have been. Their odometer showed no mileage, as though the distance traveled had been skipped entirely. The family waiting at the campsite was growing anxious, worried that something had gone wrong. When the stoners finally arrived, shaken but unharmed, their story of strange lights and sudden displacement seemed almost impossible to believe. In later years, Denise sought help from researchers, including UFO investigator Kathleen Martin, and underwent hypnotic regression. Under hypnosis, she described a strange, mirror-like craft, brilliantly illuminated, and sensations of being lifted from the vehicle by an unseen force. She remembered stepping into a soft, gel-like light that seemed to envelop her completely, moving her into the interior of the craft. There, she encountered beings with slender, humanoid forms, with large, dark eyes that radiate intelligence and curiosity rather than hostility. Ed's regression revealed similar experiences. He recalled a void of darkness, feeling weightless, and seeing a tall figure gently guiding Denise. Though his memories were not identical to hers, the overlapping elements, lost time, displacement, and strange lights, matched remarkably. The 1982 event marked the beginning of a series of unusual experiences for the stoners. In the months that followed, they reported lights following their car on quiet roads, episodes of missing time, and vivid dreams that merged seamlessly with what they believed were real experiences aboard unknown craft. Denise described sensations of being lifted or moved, and both she and Ed sometimes awoke with unexplained fatigue, disorientation, or blurred memories. These later encounters, though less dramatic than the original event, created a pattern of phenomena: sudden lights in the night sky, altered perceptions, and the recurring feeling of being watched or guided. Denise became a field investigator for UFO research, documenting not only her experiences but those of other witnesses. Through her work, she noticed striking similarities across multiple reports: sudden appearances of lights, missing time, humanoid figures, and the vivid sense of otherworldly presence that could not be easily dismissed. But what could explain such experiences? Skeptics point to sleep paralysis, a condition where the mind awakens before the body, producing intense feelings of being lifted, held, or confronted by a presence. Neurological research highlights the temporal lobe, which processes memory, perception, and emotion, as a possible source of vivid hallucinations or intense dreams that feel real. Yet, these explanations cannot fully account for multiple witnesses reporting synchronized phenomena like Denise and Ed, or the physical displacements they describe. Across hundreds of similar reports, researchers have found recurring patterns, lost time, strange lights, and humanoid beings, suggesting either an unknown psychological mechanism affecting multiple people at the same time or something truly anomalous. Some researchers propose a combination. Intense stress, cultural expectations, and neurological phenomena may shape the experience, while other elements, displaced in time and space, and physical traces remain unexplained. For the stoners, the experiences were deeply real, affecting their perception of the world, their understanding of reality, and even their professional paths. Ultimately, the stoner encounters sit at the intersection of personal testimony, unexplained phenomena, and the limits of scientific understanding. They ask difficult questions. How much of reality do we perceive? What lies just beyond our ordinary senses? And if even a fraction of such experiences reflect something real, how would it reshape our understanding of life and the universe? As Denise and Ed's story demonstrates, the skies above may hold more than stars and clouds. They hold questions that resist easy answers, events that leave no trace yet change lives, and encounters that linger long after the night has passed. It was a quiet January morning near Acapulco, Mexico. Armando Zurbaran set out on a routine drive to a business meeting. The road was familiar, the air was still, but something unusual was waiting just ahead. As he drove, he noticed a strange light hovering in the distance, unlike anything he had ever seen. At first, he assumed it was a reflection, a trick of sunlight dancing across the waves, but as he approached, the light grew brighter, more intense, until the world itself seemed to shift around him. Suddenly, Armando was no longer on the familiar road. Hours passed, perhaps days. He could not tell. Time no longer behaved the way it should. He found himself aboard a craft unlike any vehicle he had ever imagined. The interior was clean, almost sterile, yet filled with an air of quiet authority. Figures moved in the distance, human-like in appearance, yet marked by an otherworldly precision. They watched him carefully. They communicated in low tones that seemed to carry meaning beyond words. During his time aboard, Armando was given food. Simple food, yet flavorful, nourishing in a way he could not fully explain. He observed what he believed to be the craft's propulsion system, the gravity repulsion mechanism that allowed it to move in ways that defied earthly physics. Everywhere he looked were instruments and displays he could not comprehend, and yet, to the crew, they seemed perfectly natural. He overheard discussions among the beings about a civilization 3,000 years old, a utopia preserved and guided by what they called a master, sometimes referred to only as number 9. They spoke of wisdom, of order, of lessons they wished to share with humanity, but also of boundaries he was not yet ready to understand. He was monitored, observed, examined, all of it carried out with meticulous calm. The beings appeared almost human, yet there was something deeply unsettling in their perfection. Every motion felt deliberate, every glance purposeful, as though they were measuring more than his actions, perhaps even his very essence. Despite the wonder of it all, Armando felt a quiet unease, a sense that he had entered a place not meant for humans. And then, as suddenly as it began, it was over. Armando found himself back on the road. Morning light stretched across the asphalt. The ocean shimmered in the distance. Hours had passed, maybe days. No one could say for certain. He carried the memory with him, detailed, vivid, impossible to ignore. A story so extraordinary it seemed almost beyond belief. It's a story that captures the imagination. A multi-day abduction, an ancient civilization, mysterious hierarchies, and advanced technology. But here is the reality. There is no confirmed contemporary record from 1954. The earliest written accounts appeared decades later. Many of the details come from secondhand sources. Stories like this often circulate wildly online without a clear origin. In that way, they can resemble modern creepypasta, fictional tales presented as fact. At Strange Encounters, we do our best to verify our reports through multiple reputable sources, because real, documented encounters grounded in evidence are often far more fascinating and far more unsettling than anything invented for the internet. Even when the facts are difficult to pin down, stories like Armando's remind us of something important. Reality can be stranger than fiction, and sometimes darker. That's it for tonight's Strange Encounters. If you liked the episode, hit like, subscribe, and ring the bell so you don't miss future stories. Share your thoughts or your own encounter in the comments below. Thanks for watching, and until next time, keep looking up.